Everybody, my name is Patsy Lois, and I'm the director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And it's my pleasure to invite you, those of you in person. It's really good to see a great turnout in person, as well as our faithful audiences online. Welcome to this symposium, Camps in the 21st Century Americas. And this symposium marks the 20th year of the establishment of the Guantánamo Bay Detention Camp at the U.S.-controlled Guantánamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba, with an exploration of detention in the Americas more broadly. And I would like to thank Professor Esther Whitfield, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Hispanic Studies and CLACS-affiliated faculty, working with Kate Goldman, CLACS' Center Manager. And Kate is no stranger to camps, as she is on the leadership team of Respond Crisis Translation, which provides translation for asylum seekers in the U.S. And she's also serving as head of the university and academic partnerships. And I really want to thank you both for bringing this incredible programming to CLACS. This symposium is our last public event for the semester, so we're ending on a high note. And it's also part of the series, and the last event, again, we're holding for this year, that we have held under the Mellon Foundation Sawyer Seminar, Rethinking the Dynamic Interplay of Migration, Race, and Ethnicity in the Caribbean and Latin America. And this seminar was awarded to CLACS, the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and Africana Studies Department Rights and Reason Theater in 2021. And it has featured 2 conferences, talks, an exhibition, musical performances, a reflection by performance artists on the immigrant experience in the U.S., etc. And we have, it continues into the spring, so please look out for our events. I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsors of this event, the Departments of Comparative Literature and the Department of Hispanic Studies. And welcome again to all of you. I really look forward to the discussion today. And I turn you over to Professor Whitfield. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Patsy. Thank you, everybody, for being here so early on a Monday morning. Really appreciate it. So thanks to the Center for Latin American Studies, to Hispanic Studies and Comparative Literature, and very much to Kate Goldman, who has had a lot of vision for this event, and I'm really grateful for that. So as Patsy said, this year marks the 20th year of the continuous operation of the detention centers at Guantánamo, Cuba, despite many efforts and pledges to close them down. The past 20 years have seen many changes in detainees' living conditions, their access to legal representation and to hearings, in information on how the centers operate, and in the number of men detained, from around 780 in the early 2000s. Nevertheless, 35 men are still there. And those released are, as many of us know, dispersed across the world in various conditions of precarity and statelessness. So I think, it's been 20 years, it's still there, and part of the thinking behind this event was to just acknowledge that. But the situation at Guantánamo, like the very existence of the U.S. base in eastern Cuba, is exceptional in many ways. But as some of today's speakers have shown, it is much less unique in some of its structuring principles, in its approach to the law as it pertains to non-US citizens, and in what Speaker Naomi Paik has written about as its construction and perpetuation of rightlessness. So today's symposium is an invitation to think about practices of detaining in relation to a broader vocabulary of holding, sheltering, even, and I put this somewhat in quotation marks, protecting, across a geography that runs from Guantánamo and Empire more broadly, to the US border with Mexico, to Martha's Vineyard, right here, and to Central Falls. So thinking of this geography in a very sort of broad and much closer to home kind of way, and to think through this through forms of advocacy that are located in the university, in volunteer work, in legal work, in state government, and in grassroots organizations. So I think we're also trying to think of this as a broad form of advocacy rather than these sort of more sort of individual ones that many people here are involved in. We have a really great program of events that go throughout the day. I won't read it to you, but I hope you can see it online. I know not everybody can stay all day, but please come for as much as you want. I think a lot of what's going to be here is going to be very, very very interesting to listen to. So again, welcome, and I'm going to move on to introducing our first speaker, Jana Lipman. So Jana Lipman is Professor of History at Tulane University. She's also a Brown alum, and she also told us last night she won the first Brown thesis prize when it was introduced. So she's she's a scholar of U.S. foreign relations, of U.S. immigration, of labor history, whose first book, Guantánamo, A Working Class History Between Empire and Revolution, tells the history of the U.S. naval base in Guantánamo Bay from the perspective of Cuban base workers. Her most recent book, In Camps, Vietnamese Refugees, Asylum Seekers and Repatriates, reveals how first asylum sites, places that hosted refugee camps, pushed the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees to reshape international refugee policy, and shows how Vietnamese activists in the camps and diasporic activists in resettlement countries influenced U.S. and international refugee policy. She's written and commented widely about U.S.-Cuba relations, about refugees and asylum seekers in scholarly venues and in media outlets. And I won't list all of them, but she's very widely published. So please join me in welcoming Jana this morning.
Thank you all so much for having me here today. And I need to begin by thanking Esther Whitfield for bringing me, for Kate Goldman, for all of her assistance. And again, I was an undergraduate here. This is the first time I'm giving a formal lecture at Brown. And I have to say that it really does bring me a great pleasure to be here. And I want to actually thank my former advisees who are still here, Professor Amy Remensnyder, and someone who's passed away, which was Jack Thomas, who really was a mentor of mine many, many years ago. And with that, I'd like to begin my talk. So let me see if I can, oh, wait, that's not the right one. Here we go. And, oh, it's on, perfect. All right, so we are all set. And I will put it on slideshow, I assume. There we go. All right. So again, thank you all so much. And this is really an extraordinary opportunity to think deeply about the long imperial history of Guantánamo, its legacies in the Americas, and its grim role in our present moment as an ongoing detention center. And I really think it's important to sort of think about the gravity of 20 years. I'm teaching a class on U.S. empire this semester, and of course, most of my students have never known a world where Gitmo was not a prison for alleged enemy combatants. And if they've heard of it at all, they assume that the base was always a prison, and they barely blink at the consequences of the U.S. sanctioning indefinite detention or bending the rule of law to the point of torture. This is really something which, at this point, has been such a long-standing practice that students are surprised to find out that it was not always a prison. My own journey to Guantánamo, though, began more than 20 years ago now, when I was a graduate student and I was interested in Cuba's relationship with Jamaica. This was the summer of 2001, before the deadly al-Qaeda attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. on September 11th. And through my research, I learned that there had been a long history of Jamaican migration to eastern Cuba. I really started this as a Caribbean sort of scholar. And that a disproportionate number of Jamaican migrants and their children became base workers on the U.S. military base in Guantánamo Bay. And if you just look here, Guantánamo is way over here, which is very far from Havana. And Jamaica, I should have brought a map of the Caribbean. I did not. Jamaica is farther to the east. And through my research, what I learned is I met base workers in Guantánamo, Cuba. So my first trip to Cuba, I went to Guantánamo, not to the base. And I met Cuban base workers who had joined the 26th of July movement in the 1950s, fought against Fulgencio Batista, and I met Cuban base workers who continued working for the U.S. military decades after the 1959 Cuban Revolution. And I met many more who simply wanted their U.S. government pensions for the years that they had worked on the base. So they had been government workers, and they wanted their pensions. Since then, I've investigated the history of refugee camps in Southeast Asia after the U.S. war in Vietnam, which led me to many places which we would characterize as peripheral: Guam, Palawan, Palau Bidong in Malaysia, and the outer islands of Hong Kong. And yet there's a similarity in my work in that I've looked at places which we often think of might be, quote, peripheral, but I would argue, in fact, are central to our understandings of U.S. power and thinking about global networks throughout the globe. Later today, we're going to hear from my good friend and colleague, Naomi Paik's work on the many Guantánamos, and she's going to help make these connections for us. However, what I would like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is to instead focus on the history of Guantánamo and on Cuba and, by the way, the Caribbean. Oh, I'm so glad. And I do have a map of the Caribbean. I did not forget. And so here we can see Cuba's relationship to Jamaica and also to Haiti. And we also have Puerto Rico. And all of these places are going to be nodes that I'm going to discuss throughout this talk. What I'd like to start is focusing on Guantánamo's Caribbean location. The violent and imperial origins of the Caribbean itself should not be forgotten. From Christopher Columbus's 1494 approach to what he dubbed Puerto Grande, to the institution of enslavement on the island of Cuba, to the long histories of Spanish imperialism, followed by military intervention and U.S. occupation. And these are not exceptional in Latin American and Caribbean history, but they do help shape our understanding of Cuba and Guantánamo. And because of the violence of the present, there's always a way that Gitmo has become shorthand for detention, incarceration, and the violation of human rights writ large. And I generally agree with this. However, I believe we also need to recognize Guantánamo's geographic reality in Cuba and the Caribbean, in both its past and its present. And so this morning, I want to focus on the base's Caribbean history and explore the fraught spaces between refugee camps and detention. The U.S. imperial vision for the Caribbean and its turn to detention for Haitian and Cuban refugees laid the groundwork for Gitmo's function as a post-9/11 prison. And this history, too, informs the increasingly punitive infrastructure that detains and excludes migrants within the United States. So here's the roadmap for the rest of my talk. First, I'm going to provide some brief definitions and explain why the U.S. has a naval base in Cuba in the first place. Second, I'm going to share a story about a man named Lorenzo Solomon, who's a Cuban worker in the 1950s. Then I will move us to thinking about Haitian refugees in 1980 and 1981. And I will end by talking briefly about Cuban refugees in the 1990s. So those are the sort of different nodes for this talk. And I would say that the slippage between strategic defense, the refugee camp, and the prison have merged, and Gitmo's history allows us to see that scaffolding and to think about what that sort of convergence means for both the past and the present. But before I go any further, I need to make sure we understand a few simple things, or basic things. First, why does the U.S. have a naval base in Cuba at all? I imagine many of Professor Whitfield's students know this, but just to make sure we are all on the same page, I want to reiterate. The U.S. acquired the naval base in Guantánamo Bay after the War of 1898, or what the U.S. calls the Spanish-American War. And before entering Santiago de Cuba, Guantánamo Bay was the U.S. Marines' initial destination. The U.S. Navy cemented its possession and claimed rights to a base in Guantánamo Bay through the Platt Amendment and the subsequent 1903 lease agreement. This treaty granted the U.S., quote, complete jurisdiction over 45 square miles of Cuban territory. So we can see this here. And this is the key point. While Cuba maintained ultimate sovereignty, the U.S. had this, other type of jurisdiction. And so we have this contradiction within the law itself. In 1934, the U.S. and Cuba renewed the lease agreement, and the U.S. gained continued rights to the base and language whereby Cuba could never force the United States to leave unilaterally. So most of us have signed a lease for an apartment at some point. If you have not yet, you will. I think it's a first-year seminar, but you will get an apartment one day, and you will sign a lease. Others of you will maybe lease a car, right? So most of us have leases in our lives at some point. Those usually have a date. You sign a 1-year lease for an apartment or a 5-year lease for a car. The U.S. lease for the naval base in Guantánamo Bay has no date, okay? It does not even say in perpetuity. There just is no date, okay? And the U.S. staked its legal claim through these treaties and to remain in compliance. In the lease, the U.S. pays roughly over $4,000 a year to keep this lease. And again, for those of you who are paying tuition, or if your parents have mortgages, you would know that $4,000 for the year is a very small amount of money for 45 square miles of territory, okay? This is not much money. Castro publicly refused to cash the check, and I believe the current Cuban government continues with this policy of refusal. So the U.S. says that it is in compliance, it pays the money, and Cuban says, this is ridiculous, we're not accepting the money, yet the base remains. Also, before it was a prison, it was far more typical of U.S. military installations. And before the Cuban Revolution, it was fairly similar to U.S. bases in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and even Japan and South Korea and Western Europe. And so I just want to show you that these are images from Guantánamo, from the base in the early 20th century. You can see a racialized image where Cubans are clearly presented as people of color compared to U.S. sailors, and also the sort of relationship to fruit and produce. So for those of you who study Latin American history more broadly, these will be themes that will be repeated. This is images of the base being built up during World War II, where it really was modernized. It becomes a major U.S. military station during World War II. Before then, it was much smaller. And also importantly, Gitmo is not just Gitmo is the base, but Guantánamo City is in fact a medium-sized Cuban city in eastern Cuba. And these are images from Guantánamo, Cuba in the 1940s. This is the main park, Pedro Perez. Here we have some of the main streets, downtown Guantánamo. And here we have some pictures of sailors on leave in Guantánamo, again in the 1940s. These are just sort of some images from my trip to Cuba. These are fairly old now, from the early 21st century. These are sort of Soviet-era housing. And here's the Plaza de la Revolución. And so to make sure that you recognize that the city of Guantánamo is about 15 miles from the base. It is about an 18-hour bus ride on a good bus from Havana. And it is also a fairly large community of over 100,000 people. So it's not small, okay? It's like a medium-sized city. I should add that I've never been to the base, so my research has all been in Guantánamo, Cuba. And to think about this sort of relationship between the city and the base, as we also think about how places of incarceration in our own communities are often kept far from sort of urban centers. What does it mean when people are sent to Martha's Vineyard, for example? Why are people sent to an island, or why are they then sent to a military base? How is that separated from other communities? So those are some ground rules, or not ground rules, but sort of thoughts, like why do we have a base there? Where is Guantánamo? What is the relationship between Guantánamo and the base? So here we go. All right, so I want to share now a story, which I imagine is unfamiliar to many of you, and if you did read about this, hopefully it will continue to raise some questions. And so in Cuba, from the 1940s and 50s, even before the Cuban Revolution, one of the biggest questions remained what legal standard governed the base. Was there going to be Cuban law on the base or U.S. law on the base? And in the 1940s, local Guantánamo journalist Lino Lemes, which is a caricature from the local Cuban press, wrote, quote, "The workers on the U.S. naval base are not protected by the American social laws nor by Cuban social laws. By social laws, he meant pensions, minimum wage, leave policies, how much were you going to get paid? If you got hurt, how did you get compensated? And because the base fell outside Cuban jurisdiction, but their rights under U.S. jurisdiction were thin at best, workers were often left in the lurch. They would know what law governs their employment. And on September 15th, 1954, and remember this is before the Cuban Revolution, 8 cartons of Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes were found missing in the naval exchange. And base worker Lorenzo Solomon was the prime suspect. In short order, the base officials accused Solomon of stealing $1,543 in cigarettes from the exchange. So they thought that he was pilfering cigarettes and most likely selling them on the black market in Guantánamo, Cuba. Now, typically, when base officers believed a crime had been committed by a local civilian, and he was actually of Jamaican descent, but he had been living in Cuba. I believe he was born in Cuba. They would fire the worker, and they would press charges against the alleged, thief in Guantánamo or Santiago de Cuba. But in this case, they took a more punitive course. They were frustrated because the local Cuban courts were not prosecuting or convicting the Cubans who were stealing things off the base. The Cuban courts weren't really upset. Again, this is a military base that's on their territory, so the fact that someone's stealing some cigarettes is not of great interest to the Cuban legal system, okay? And so the U.S. military was upset about this. And so instead of pressing charges in Cuba, they detained Solomon for 2 weeks without ever notifying his family, a lawyer, or the base union, which existed at the time. Rumors spread throughout the base when workers realized that the U.S. Navy had thrown Solomon in jail without a trial. Jose Repilado Perez, a delegate of the base workers' union, described the crisis in biblical language. Lorenzo Solomon disappeared as if he had been swallowed by the earth. On release, Solomon claimed that he had been wrongfully accused, beaten, and tortured until he signed a false confession. In an interview, Solomon described his ordeal in detail. He said, quote, "Immediately they imprisoned me. I could only stand on my feet. There I was, incommunicado for 15 days. The intelligence officer hit me with his open hand on the nape of the neck," and that's what he's describing in this image. "When I fell to the floor, a marino who came with the officer clubbed me in the stomach and liver. I fainted with pain, and I woke up in a hospital." He elaborated that he'd been forced to stand for 14 to 15 hours each day, could not change his clothes, received rotten potatoes and dirty water, and was regularly beaten. In the end, he signed a confession that he had stolen the cigarettes. Solomon added that his confinement was so brutal that if the officials had asked him if he had killed Abraham Lincoln, he would have confessed to that too. Now, in response to this, the base union leaders, Angel Calzado and Jose Perez Rubilado, began an intense and vocal campaign for the rights of base workers. Now, the union leadership never defended his innocence. I want to be clear about that. That wasn't the claim they were making. Rather, they objected to the Navy's practice of unauthorized detention and abuse. And I should add, I found all these documents in 2004. So right sort of in the moment when this was actually gaining traction by international human rights activists. And here I was finding the story about a Cuban raising very similar questions from the 1950s. And I was struck by the intensity of their language. Through radio programs, union bulletins, and direct communication with the U.S. State Department, union leaders denounced U.S. officials. They even went so far as to compare U.S. base intelligence officers to communists and to fascists. They concluded by calling on American ideals, quote, "We could not conceive that in a naval establishment of the most powerful nation in the world, champion of democracy, things like this could happen, much less use methods and systems of terror." They later claimed that the language of democracy and liberalism for themselves, and they rejected claims that they were communists. They said, "No, this is not communism. We who speak thus are enemies of the Iron Curtain, but we are also enemies of any type of oppression, harming human dignity, hence the dignity of the country we belong to," We are real Democrats. And this is the sort of letterhead for the union in Guantánamo, for the base workers union. Now, not surprisingly, the U.S. Navy fired these union leaders. However, it did have to negotiate and deflect this radical critique. For the next 5 years, until the Cuban Revolution, as far as I can tell, the U.S. Navy did not attempt to detain any other worker outside the law. This essentially created a problem for them, which they decided to then avoid. Moreover, the State Department repeatedly told the Navy that they'd overstepped their bounds. They said, legally you might be right, but this local outcry was not worth the risk to U.S.-Cuban relations or the possible clamor to renegotiate the lease. So the Navy never said that the U.S. military didn't have the right, but they said this is not worth the political problems that it is causing us. And I come back to this story again and again, but because it continues to shock and surprise me, although perhaps it shouldn't, that Cubans were having similar debates about the law, detention, and yes, even torture almost 50 years before January 2002. And in this case, the central question was whether or not U.S. or Cuban law applied on the base, and the Cuban workers' insistence that some law must apply. Now, while the scope is different, Solomon was one man held for 2 weeks, not over 700 men, and not people held for over 20 years. And the current concern was related to stolen cigarettes and not national security. His testimony still resonates. And Solomon attests to being beaten until he confesses, underscoring the unreliableness of confessions made under duress. He most certainly did not kill Abraham Lincoln in violent circumstances. And it demonstrates that activism and anger of Cuban workers, that a Cuban could be detained without charges or trial, and their language could not have been stronger. They did not mince their words, calling out the U.S. government as, quote, fascist and, quote, communist. And here we can see a specifically Caribbean and Cuban protest against the base. This was not a protest against the U.S. military base being there. It was not an anti-base critique explicitly. This would come years later with the Cuban Revolution. But rather, it was a critique against unchecked power. The base workers' union recognized the principle at stake for both Cuba and for the United States. And the base workers were right in their concern that if the U.S. evaded its own laws on Gitmo, that it would then create a dangerous and undemocratic precedent. And I would add one constitutive of the initial lease agreement. So that is our first story. So I want us to hold it, and I want us to really think about sort of the Cuban critique and this Cuban concern about the absence of the law over 50 years ago, 70 years ago. Okay. Now bear with me, because we're going to move geographically, and we're going to move chronologically. So now I want us to think about the Caribbean again more broadly, and we're going to think about Haitians, here is Haiti, going to Miami in small boats, and we want to think also about Puerto Rico, okay, which remains a U.S. territory or a U.S. colony. Puerto Rico is still a colonized space, right? So these are our current notes in this next section. Okay, and I want us to move chronologically to 1980, okay? So we're moving from the 50s to 1980, 1981. And I hope this seeming detour will help us see how the stories of U.S. imperial circuits and their constitutive military power and dodging of constitutional standards came to bear on late 20th century refugee camps. And here, too, we see a Caribbean precedent for the denial of rights before the U.S. government transferred this model to Gitmo. And this will move our conversation to thinking about migration and refugees as we think about detention. So in 1980, along with the more than 100,000 Cubans who entered the United States through the Mariel boat lift, which was a fairly major migration movement in 1980, there were approximately 10,000 Haitians. And these individuals received a very nebulous legal status, which was Cuban Haitian entrance status pending. They were not given refugee status. And I would again suggest that anytime the government comes up with a new legal status, to raise your eyebrows. Why is this new legal status being created? Haitians were initially housed in substandard facilities in Florida. Oh, here's images from the Mariel boat lift. These are Cubans. Here again are Cubans coming to the U.S. in 1980. And here are news articles about Haitians who were also coming at the same time. And these Haitians lived in very poor conditions. They were initially housed on a former U.S. Nike missile base in Florida. So it was a former military sort of installation transformed into a refugee camp for Haitians in 1980. And these conditions were quite poor. As one Haitian man said, "The conditions here are very bad. Here we live like animals. The food is bad. At night there is no light and we fight the snakes." Ira Kurzban, who becomes one of the most persistent and unflagging legal advocates for Haitians in Miami, characterized this base, Chrome, as, quote, intolerable and atrocious, and he demanded immediate changes, threatening legal action if the situation did not improve. Even the Florida Department of Health agreed and insisted that the U.S. government, quote, close Chrome. And the government's attempt to close Chrome was telling, because one idea of what to do was to send Haitians who were being held in Miami to a U.S. Army base in Puerto Rico. Okay? And again, the thing hopefully we'll continue with our conversation about why migrants were brought from Florida to Martha's Vineyard, in this case, from Florida to Puerto Rico. Okay? Now, initially this happened under President Jimmy Carter. And he broadcast his plans to move Haitians to Fort Allen, and the Miami Herald reported that many Puerto Ricans resented, quote, being used as a colonial dumping ground for Mr. Carter's problems. One letter to the editor reiterated that the United States action smelled of old-fashioned imperialism. Hundreds of local residents protested against the proposed camps, and thousands more marched in San Juan. In some instances, protesters took a principled stand with chants and gritos, declaring, "We cannot permit the construction of concentration camps in our land." Yet there were other slogans that only protested the use of Puerto Rican land for such camps. In an unsettling and prophetic idiom, one person shouted, "Carter, send them to Guantánamo." The plan, however, stalls out under President Carter. I won't get into all the weeds of the legal debates, and this doesn't happen. But then Carter loses re-election, and Ronald Reagan is elected into office. And in 1981, under Ronald Reagan, they relaunched this idea of deterring Haitian migrants into the United States, and they do this through a policy of interdiction of both sending Haitians back to Haiti, as well as detaining Haitians who do reach the United States. And again, to alleviate overcrowding at the Chrome Detention Center, the U.S. decided to send Haitians to facilities across the United States, including Morgantown, West Virginia, Big Springs, Texas, Otisville, New York, and again to Fort Allen in Puerto Rico. And this time, the U.S. government does send Haitians to Puerto Rico. In August of 1981, 794 Haitian men and women, the largest single contingent of Haitians, were sent to Fort Allen, languishing there for more than a year. And by many accounts, the conditions at Fort Allen were worse than at Chrome. Chrome at least had semi-permanent buildings, and while on Fort Allen, Haitians lived with tents and in the full force of the Caribbean sun. And despite Fort Allen's relative isolation within Puerto Rico, Fort Haitian allies there organized a coalition to support the Haitians. And there was a small but active Haitian community within Puerto Rico, and they began this sort of robust campaign. For example, Inez Mendoza, who is the widow of the former governor Luis Muñoz Marin, and he's the major political figure in Puerto Rico, she protested the transfer of Haitians to Puerto Rico. She said, quote, "We will be accomplices in crimes against humanity if we were to imprison Haitians like animals." She stated flatly that Puerto Rico had no obligation to jail Haitians. That is my protest. The Organization of American States, again, not a radical organization, even authorized a delegation to visit Chrome at Fort Allen, making it the first time the OAS investigated the United States for alleged human rights violations. And in April of 1982, 38 Haitian women held at Fort Allen wrote directly to President Reagan, and the New York Times published their letter. The women refuted their representation as, quote, economic migrants and denounced the United States for its inhumane treatment. In a separate protest, 33 women at Chrome persisted in a week-long hunger strike. Collectively, Mendoza, Esquivel, the OAS delegation, and the Haitian women themselves demonstrated a growing coalition and a regional solidarity against Haitians' unprecedented and indeterminate detention. In 1982, the courts ordered the release of Haitian refugees from Fort Allen, Chrome, and the attendant jails throughout the nation. However, the courts did not outlaw the policy of detention, but rather this process only intensified. The Chrome Detention Center was not closed, and it remains in southern Florida with an abysmal human rights record, which disproportionately has prevented Haitians from entering the United States. Devised as an emergency measure, an unsanitary and disgraceful one at that, Chrome would become a permanent detention center, infamously holding asylum seekers without legal counsel. And if you have not, and these are just from its current website, and if you've not yet read it, I strongly recommend Brother, I'm Dying by Ebony Dandicat, which talks about her uncle who dies at the Chrome Detention Center in the early 21st century. Here we can see the themes that continue to resonate, the American imperial legacies, which created the legal infrastructure to detain and erode legal rights. But we can also see activism by both Haitians themselves and their allies. And so I want to find, and these are just images from recent, so this allegations of beatings at Chrome. I want to conclude soon because I know people have to go to class and I want to have some time for questions. So let's just talk briefly then about bringing us back to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. Briefly, there are Cuban refugees who leave again in the 1990s. And these Cubans, much like, and also for those of you who don't know, 220,000 Cubans have left Cuba in the last year. We're currently going through a moment of massive migration of Cubans who are leaving the island and often finding themselves now in a similar precarious position as other migrants. They no longer have the same privileges that they had in the past. And in the 1990s, Cubans left in large numbers. This is at the end of the Cold War, a moment of economic insecurity in Cuba. And they again take to the seas. And these were often termed as the balseros. And President Clinton is president at the time. And he was very concerned that this would create political problems for him. He remembered the Cuban Mariels refugees that created political problems for him in 1980. And so he said, let us send these Cubans to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. And we are able to legally do that. And that will prevent people from coming to the U.S., detain people. And so Cubans were sent to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. And for those of you who don't work on the Cuban Guantánamo Public Memory Project, this is a story which hopefully is somewhat familiar to you. And the Cubans who were on the naval base in Guantánamo Bay had this, in some ways, almost kaleidoscope experience where they had left Cuba only to be brought back to Cuba. And many of those felt that quite viscerally. And unlike Haitians, who are also held on the naval base, the majority of Cubans were allowed to go to the United States. There's a lot of legal wrangling. There's a lot of protests. The Cuban-American community has significantly more political clout than other immigrant communities. And so the most of the Cubans who came to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay do go to the United States. However, there are some who did not. And so this, I think, brings us to the post-9/11 era. Because Camp X-Ray, before it was a detention center for post-9/11, quote, enemy combatants, it was where the U.S. military sent Cuban, quote, troublemakers on the base. And this was sent to Camp X-Ray. And while the vast majority of the Cuban balseros do go to the United States, about 970 were repatriated back to Cuba. And for Cubans believed guilty for crimes on the base, and these could range from disruption to petty theft to violence. There was, again, a large range. There was no legal due process. Rather, they were kept in the camps. And as Elizabeth Campisi, a camp mediator and later anthropologist, wrote, "We were not permitted to visit Camp X-Ray until near the end of the operation, when I assumed that conditions had improved too. They had difficult to imagine what it was like to begin with. As we approached the camp, people who had been told that they would be sent back to Cuba gathered by the part of the fence at the entrance and loudly protested their innocence. We were not allowed to go near them, let alone accept notes for relatives back in the camps. The Balseros and Camp X-Ray had no access to due process, and the INS had strictly forbidden anyone to help them in any way." End quote. And so here we have that the military sort of extra-legal system for Cubans who created disturbances on the base were in the very same place that would then be repurposed for the first group of alleged enemy combatants after September 11th. And so while the arbitrariness of detention loomed large, again, I want to sort of think about this Cuban story as it leads into the post-9/11 era. So where to end, because I want to make sure we have some time for questions, how to conclude. How to connect these stories of Lorenzo Solomon to Haitians at Fort Allen, to Cubans and Camp X-Ray, to the conversations we will hopefully have later today about incarceration and detention here in New England. First, Gitmo and Guantanamo's Cuban and Caribbean history matters. We need to remember that Gitmo does not take place in a nebulous space, but rather that the long legacies of U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean made it possible. Today, we see that the longevity of this type of militarism looks like in people's bodies. And I think of Carol Rosenberg's recent essay about how Gitmo is becoming essentially a place for elderly people, right? A place which needs surgeries and medical care for elderly detainees who are needing medical help. But this should also make us think about the Cubans. There's still, I think, 17 Cubans who live on the naval base. I'm happy to talk about this as well, who are also elderly people. And the U.S. military also provides medical services for elderly Cubans. It's the only nursing home in a U.S. military base. And it's for the Cubans who have retired there. So again, thinking about these long stories of U.S. imperialism. Second, we can think about the stories of detention. The transformation of spaces from one form of detention to apparatuses to another. This is not to argue that they were identical, but rather that there are sinews between these stories of detention. And finally, that these histories are not uncontested, nor are they monovocal. The story of Solomon identifies Cuban base workers who fought for the rule of law, so thinking about the role of protest even in Cuba in the 1950s. In the story of the Haitians, we can see activist lawyers, Puerto Rican politicians, diasporic Haitian activists, and refugees themselves protesting the removal to Fort Allen. And again, in the 1990s, we can see Cubans protesting the direction, or the introduction of Cubans to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay, and protests against their confinement there as well. And as today, later day, we'll be hearing about both Brown students and activists who've been working with asylum seekers, again, here in New England. These stories of Gitmo and Guantanamo's Cuban and Caribbean circuits are important to remember, as Gitmo has become an international symbol and warning, because Gitmo and Guantanamo's future will also remain in Cuba and the Caribbean, even as their legacies have pervaded the so-called domestic the United States, vis-a-vis detention camps in my own home state of Louisiana and here in New England. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. So great, and I'm happy to hear your questions.
Happy to moderate any questions here. I know that many of you have to leave quite soon. If you have any questions, please ask them now. Evelyn.
So I was going to say, do you have any, I'm sorry, Evelyn, do you want to take the students' questions? If there's, just the students, if they have to leave at 10, I have to.
Do students want to go first?
Okay, never mind, no worries,
Think
go.
about it. And you're welcome to stay.
Yeah.
Set a good example for the students. Just back to earlier on in your talk, when you talk about the labor union that protested, but before that, you talked about how there was a question about whose law applied. So was that labor union a Cuban labor union or an American labor union? Because it's a union that represented workers on the base. Right?
That is a really good question. So in the 1940s and 1950s in Cuba, there was a fairly strong labor movement, although it was not particularly radical. It was and so that particular union is actually really interesting. The American Federation of Labor had an overseas bureau that would go to Latin America to help form anti-communist unions. They were interested in stopping communism in Latin America, and they sent delegations to Argentina, to Brazil, all over the Caribbean to stop radical workers' rights organizations. And interestingly, that sort of mission helped found the union in Guantánamo Bay. So it was sort of started by sort of a U.S. labor leader, Sarah, you're not, I'm sure people have studied this, Romaldi, who was one of the sort of this lead, he was an Italian-American, and he goes and he starts these unions. But it was for Cuban workers. It was all run by Cuban workers. It was meant, I think, to almost show like U.S.-Cuban friendship at the time, this sort of moment of cooperation. However, what I would argue is that the based workers, particularly because of this case, became far more radical than the union sort of founders wanted. And it was a way that they were then able to use the based workers union to articulate their own form of nationalist politics. The base union is then essentially defanged after this. It is not strong after this 1954-55 moment. But it's this moment of Cold War politics.
So quickly, was this union registered as a Cuban union or as an American union?
Oh, it's an interesting question. So the short answer is I don't know. It was a cooperative with the AFL-CIO, but it also worked. I'm getting in the weeds here. Maybe we can talk afterwards. But Eusebio Mojal, who was the head of the Cuban Workers Union at the time, was from Guantánamo, and so he was also very involved with this union. I don't know if it was formally registered with the Cuban Workers Union or not, but it was very much in conversation with other Cuban unions. And Mojal's relationship to Batista was very close, and there's a lot of corruption there. So that's a bit of a divergence, but it's an important point. Yes. Yes.
Just make sure you turn it on.
I think it's for the live streaming.
Hello. Spending time, like a decent amount of time in Guantánamo, the city, I was wondering what you thought, like the clearest ways you could see the effect of the base, like just by like talking to people. Like how did you see like the base's like legacy and impact?
All right, so really, really good question. And it's what I've thought about a lot, as Professor Whitfield knows. So the first, I would say two things. One is that in my conversations with people, there's a nostalgia for the base, which I was not expecting. I'm very critical of the U.S. military base and basing system. I have been in my work. But when I spoke to people in Guantánamo, Cuba, they remember working on the base as a very good job, as a place that had very good salaries, very stable work, as an access to American culture that they didn't have otherwise. You have to realize that the standard of living in Cuba is very low. There's a great amount of economic insecurity and a great amount of poverty, although there's some basics in terms of standards of living, but a great amount of economic insecurity. People are constantly having to struggle in terms of, even providing basic food. And so their jobs on the base were ones that they remember generally really positively. And as a scholar, I had to wrestle with that because I thought I was going to go and hear all these stories about U.S. Militarism and anti-American politics. And people have been criticized me. They said, oh, you're going to, like, I remember one review of my book was like, oh, she went there. And of course the Cubans had bad things to say about the base. I was like, no, did you read the book? Like the Cubans, like all, like actually, again, I think it's somewhat nostalgic. I mean, there's also they'd lost their jobs for over 50 years. And so over time, that was a moment of economic security. You have to recognize that the only other jobs they had were most likely in the sugar industry, which were far more brutal. And so working in the base was actually often a move of social mobility. In addition, though, the two other things to make that even more complicated. One is the anger was, again, not at the military base being there. The anger was at the U.S. government not fulfilling its promises to pay pensions. And so much of the anger was that the U.S. should pay the pensions to the workers who had dedicated 10, 15, 20 years of working for the U.S. government. So that was what people wanted to talk to me about. And I often felt very limited because I was not able to help them get their pensions. The third thing, though, which I think is even more confusing might be the word, but made me think a lot and I found very upsetting was a silence about the current use of the naval base. So I spent about 5 months in Guantánamo, Cuba in 2004 and 2005. This is a moment when the law cases that you've been studying were front and center in the international news. And when I was in Guantánamo, Cuba, not one person ever asked me about the post-9/11 detainees or mentioned the torture or the detention on the base. And that silence to me was really chilling. And no one mentioned it, no one brought it up. There was zero discussion about it at all. And so there was a real question of silence, and I'm happy to share the essay that I've written about that silence, but I think it speaks to silences in Cuba about the absence of both due process and about the questions of detention in Cuba, which complicate these questions for Cubans as they talk about detention in the naval base in Guantanamo Bay.
Hi.
Can I just say, if you have class at 10,
Yeah, you can go.
fine to get up and leave.
Yeah.
But please stay if you want to. It's not at all
Yeah.
rude to leave.
Yeah, and also if people have questions for me later, feel free to email me. I'm happy to be in touch with students if you have questions afterwards. I know you have to go to class, that's fine.
Thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I liked very much the Pan-Caribbean, overview that you gave. Mm-hmm. I also come from a place based where there is in Sicily, where there is the biggest U.S. Military base, and Sigonella, and I know this kind of conflict. I mean, in that case, it's like a strong conflict between the people of the area and then the invasion, basically, of the U.S. military base and the kind of fear and risks that this brings, particularly now in the case of Ukraine and the war. But my question is not there, although I have two questions for you. You said that you ever entered the base, so if you can explain a little bit more about this. And the other one, can you say something a bit more about the Guantánamo Public Memory Project, please?
Sure, absolutely. So the first, so some of this is just personal. So I started my research in Washington, D.C. in the National Archives. That's where I found the story of Lorenzo Solomon for the first time. The National Archives was a really rich source. I then went to Cuba and did my research in Guantánamo, Cuba. This was also very complicated. For those of you who've done research in Cuba, know that it's very difficult to get permission to do research in Cuba. You have to be sponsored. The library was closed the entire time I was there. I had to get special permission to use the library. Anyway, so when I came back, I did want to go to the naval base. Again, this was 2004, 2005. For the most part, you have to be a journalist to go. And again, I didn't go largely because I stopped trying. So I wrote a letter to my senator at the time, Joe Lieberman. He was on the sort of committee of the armed services. I didn't know how I was going to get on the base. I asked for permission to go. I never heard. I think I tried one or two other requests. But the short answer is I decided I didn't need to go for my research. I think one of the critiques I would have of my book is that I think I do a really good job showing complexity of Cubans and Caribbean actors. I don't show a lot of complexity about the U.S. sailors who are stationed there. My analysis and study of the Americans on the base is much thinner. And in some ways I decided to not pursue getting permission to go to the U.S. military base. I was a little bit concerned if I went to the base that might compromise my ability to do more work in Cuba. I was a little bit concerned. I just stopped trying. I also had a new job. I had a baby, and I just had a book, and I wanted to get my book published, and I just said, enough. So I never tried after that. So the answers, and it was a research decision, though. And what I wanted, actually, for those of you who are in Professor Whitfield's class, I wanted the Guantánamo Gazette, which is the base newspaper, which is published there. However, it's now been digitized, so now my research argument for going there, unfortunately, has declined. If I said, I need to go because I need to see the Gazette, they would say, well, just go to the, Holly Ackerman's done all your work for you. Just go online and look at it. So I never went for that reason. I would like to go, just 'cause I'd like to see the space. I think being there physically could be very useful. But I've not actually attempted to go in many, many years. And I think at this point, the U.S. government would allow me. If I said if I was able to get a magazine to say, Jana, write an article about X, and I said, sure, I don't see any reason why I would be denied if I had a writing gig. The U.S. has allowed hundreds and hundreds of journalists to go, and I know lots of people who have gone. And you have to go as a journalist. So you need to have a writing gig to be able to go. The Guantánamo Public Memory Project is a project that both Naomi and Esther and I worked on, and actually came to Brown in, 2014, 2015. So this really comes out of my good colleague Liz Sevchenko. She had founded an organization called the International Sites of Conscience, which is a consortium of human rights museums around the globe. And she put together a conference in 2009. I remember because it was right after the birth of my daughter. And she was 7 weeks old, and I was like, I need to go to this conference. And it was about bringing together scholars about Guantánamo, lawyers representing the detainees, and people working in museums. And it was a sort of odd conference, but it was really generative, and she is amazing. And out of that, she said, well, what would it be like if we created a museum about the naval base in Guantánamo Bay? And so she worked with schools, of which Brown is a key partner, to develop an exhibit about the naval base in Guantánamo Bay and its history. So I can easily send you the link to it afterwards. It has a really good web presence, but it was also a physical exhibit, and it showed these stories about the naval base's Cuban and early 20th century history, about its history as a refugee camp for Cubans and for Haitians, and the post 9/11. It traveled to, I think, 14 or 15 universities. I brought it to Tulane as well. And each university did its own series of speakers and talks and workshops as it related to their local communities. Right now, their exhibit is on environmental justice. I don't know if it's come to Brown recently or not. And it's a really great model for thinking about public humanities, including student work and activist/scholarly collaborations. So, and I felt really great to be able to work on it. And I did bring it to Tulane, and we did a whole set of programming around the relationship between Tulane and Louisiana, New Orleans, and the Caribbean, as well as incarceration in Louisiana along its visit to Tulane.
I was just wondering, considering Guantanamo's proximity to Jamaica and China's current presence in the country, do you believe U.S. concerns about proximity to China, especially given its role as a rising global power, has any influence over the U.S.'s continued occupation at Guantánamo?
Oh, that's interesting. I've not really been following China and the Caribbean, although China is trying to create ties, globally. That's an interesting question. I think a U.S. security perspective, potentially, right? The U.S. would say we still need the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. It'd be concerned if another country, quote, had that territory, whether that was Russia or China or, Venezuela. I do think, though, what I would argue about the U.S. military bases' strategic value is really, though, in its ability to act as this extra legal space. And that is what the U.S. military has really been able to use the base for. There are people in the military who argue that it is a poor use of resources, that the U.S. can do everything it does in Gitmo in Florida, as far as, surveillance, training, et cetera. They don't need the base. It is always difficult, and this is not unique to the United States, for a country to, quote, give something up. States generally don't want to do that. I generally think that the security risk to the United States would be low, although presumably there are, military officials who could argue why. If China was to have a base in the Caribbean, the U.S. would see that as a threat. There's no doubt to that, right? China equally sees all the U.S. military bases in the Pacific as a threat, right? So that is the way of states. And I think that the U.S. is always, sort of thinking about that. But really, the fact that the U.S. has kept it there, it is about some of these refugee issues. And there are definitely plans in the military about if there are, another outpouring of Haitians or even, I think, Cubans by boat to use the naval base as a detention center. And so I remember when the earthquake in Haiti was in 2011, there was all sorts of analyses about what to do in terms of bringing people there. It's a good question, though. And the U.S., just for people to know, and Naomi talked about this later, has bases all over the globe, and other countries do see them as threats, as you were saying, right, in Italy. And the U.S. is very, not surprisingly, does not want other states to have military bases in close proximity. So, yeah, you have a question?
So, tracing back to 40s and 50s, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on Guantanamo's position globally, because you have the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you have an expansion of, or a definition of kind of the refugee camp as we currently know it. And so how does Guantanamo kind of fit into that puzzle of these spaces where rights are being negated?
So it's a really good question, and I would actually argue that those questions don't relate to Guantanamo then, but I'll explain why. So in the 40s and 50s, you're right, you have the UN Declaration of Human Rights, you have a recognition of the centrality of camps because of World War II, but at that point in the 40s and 50s, the base in the naval base in Guantanamo Bay was much more about conversations of U.S. military bases in Germany or Japan. So it was much more about these questions of sort of the expansion of the U.S. military power after World War II. And so these questions about human rights, well, I do find these local stories about it. This was not in any way in a larger dialogue with international activists about human rights or about camps. Rather, it was one of many places that the United States had this new, very robust, military structure after World War II and after the Korean War, right? And at both of those moments, we see the base grow. So one moment where the base grows is in 1940. It's because of World War II. The next time it grows is in 1950. It's because of the Korean War. And so it's much more in that type of geography. And what I would argue for you and where it changes is in the 40s and 50s, it's really not that different. Well, there's one thing that's different, but from like these other bases, in Italy and Germany and South Korea. But the difference is those countries have status of forces agreements, right? Status of forces agreements are legal agreements between host countries and the United States about what to do if a U.S. Marine, gets drunk at a bar, or what to do in these legal situations. Gitmo does not have one because of that 1903 lease agreement, right? So there is no status of forces agreement. But in addition, and this goes back to your questions about the union, there is a lot of interaction. You have several thousand people working on the base, you have people going off the base, you have all this interaction between Cubans and Americans in the Cuban city of Guantanamo. And I would argue that sort of created a check on the power of the base, because they have to negotiate with Cuba. They want good relations with Cuba, or good enough relations with Cuba, so they don't want major problems, okay? But with the Cuban Revolution, and I can talk about that as well, because actually a lot of the workers on the base joined the 26th of July movement. Others of them are very supportive of, Fidel Castro for the reasons that most Cubans were. But after 1959, there becomes a rupture between the base and Cuba. And it's that separation which makes Gitmo more like these sites of detention or refugee camps today. It's because it's really after 1964, but after 1964, you only have a couple hundred Cubans going back and forth every day. You have this separation. And at that point, all of the workers, and this is very much about contemporary incarceration, the workers after 64 are from Jamaica and from the Philippines. And this is the beginning of outsourcing. This is the beginning of migrant workers coming with even fewer rights. They do not have a union after 1964, these, contract workers from Jamaica. And so what happens is it's at that point that Gitmo takes on the more camp-like isolated formation, which allows it to be a detention camp. I think that if it was still like the 1948 naval base, it would not have become the detention camp that it becomes after 2001. The U.S. does not send, the detainees to its bases in Germany, right? I know the U.S. does send people to Poland. The U.S. does have these secret black sites. It's not that the U.S. doesn't do that, but its major military installations with its allies, there's a lot of pressure from those countries to not do that. Right? And those cases are going on in the EU right now. And so it's really that isolation that happens after the revolution that creates the isolation and the parameters for the U.S. to believe that it can act without any sort of support from it. Doesn't need Cuba at all, right? It actually is helpful that it has no relationships with Cuba. Other questions? Sure.
This is such an interesting discussion. Yeah. If I may just continue the same line of thinking of it seems that when Guantánamo Bay was, the naval base was established, 1903, you say?
I mean, that's when the lease agreement is signed.
But that's the time when the U.S. empire reached its height. It crossed the Pacific to the Philippines and went through Guam, both of which were also Spanish territory at one time. And there are still military bases on those places, right?
Yep.
Whereas if you think of Germany, Germany was never an American colony, et cetera, et cetera. But the bases, I believe, in the Philippines are still operating, although they have
right now
very seriously renegotiated their relationship. Guam is an interesting case, as you know, because the little island of Guam is so dependent on the military base for its economic well-being. Can you put these, put this picture together, because you also examine the U.S. empire, how these bases in the U.S. empire.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. So I would argue, so you are correct, and broadly. So my colleague David Vine has written the most about this. He has a book called Bases of Empire, and David and I have done a lot of work together over the years. But you are correct. So it really begins in the late 19th century, where the U.S. begins to have these military installations, Pearl Harbor, also in Hawaii, and these build up in the early 20th century. And I would argue the military, it sets the stage for it, but it's really with World War II that they become sort of the massive military installations that we know today. And they really do operate globally. I mean, this is why the U.S. has such a strong military power. And again, Naomi's going to talk about this later today in her talk. But so in the Pacific, and the U.S. uses different legal statuses. This is why I said, whenever the U.S. comes up with a new set of terms, to raise your eyebrows, because the U.S. doesn't talk about Guam as a colony, right? It doesn't talk about the Marshall Islands as colonies, but the U.S. has military installations, and the Marshall Islands are an independent country, but they have this special relationship with the United States. So the U.S. after World War II decides that it's valuable, that it creates power, and it's accurate, it does, by keeping its footprint in the Pacific, as well as larger bases in Germany. And also, I mean, you're saying Germany's not a colony. It's true. Germany's not a colony. It's sovereign. Yet there are lots of bases in Germany, and it was controversial, right? In Italy's not a colony, but Italy has U.S. military bases, and it creates these questions of sovereignty, and it pushes against the sovereignty of even, countries like Japan or South Korea, right? And so these then become real central to U.S. military power, particularly in the Cold War. And then, particularly after 9/11, the U.S., rather than saying, there was a sort of discussion in the 90s, right, that the U.S. is going to have a peace dividend, or there's going to be this change in U.S. military posture after 1991. This does not happen, as we know. And instead, the United States continues to use these military bases. And one of the things that's interesting in terms of your question about these islands is actually Donald Rumsfeld had this idea called the lily pad bases. He understood that states often resented hosting large military installations. And he believed that if you had smaller bases with a smaller footprint, that you could actually still project the same type of power and have less political pushback because they were less visible. We see this also with drone strikes, right? And so this persists. And they're part of a larger fabric, and I would argue they both need their own historical investigations. And so Guam, for example, is a U.S. territory. I would argue that it's a colony, but this is complicated. People studying Guam include Alfred Flores, who's writing a book about the U.S. military bases in Guam. He's at Harvey Mudd. Evan Espiritu who's writing about this as well. And this is a place where you have massive military bases. The U.S. has actually been wanting to increase its bases in Guam as it's pulled back in Japan a little bit, right? So you can see, we're going to pull back in one place, we're going to grow in another place. And likewise, Guam has a really complicated relationship with the military. There's a very strong indigenous and anti-base movement in Guam. You also have a very large number of Chamorros serving in the U.S. military. And so you have both of those existing side by side. So those are just general thoughts. But there's a lot of work, and you are correct to think about this globally. And the last thing that I'll add, I said I'd never given a talk at Brown. That's essentially true. But I was at a workshop here probably 15 years ago. And it was a workshop that your colleague Kathy Lutz put together. And she wrote this book, Homefront, about Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And we had been part of a consortium that was talking about U.S. military bases, and we had a follow-up meeting here. And I remember Kathy always said that, we study, I studied the naval base in Guantánamo Bay, and she was studying Fort Bragg, and David Vine was studying Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. And she said that, no, we don't need this sort of every base getting its own book. She said the military thinks about it as a system. And we need to think about it as a system, as scholars and as activists. And so really thinking about what does it mean to think about it as a system and not just one base here and one base there. And so that, I think, is you're accurate. And what does that mean for us to step back and think about that system?
To follow up, if I may, you talked about Guantánamo as a place where we've sent detainees for very specific reasons. Were any of the Southeast Asian refugees sent to American bases?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which bases?
So I've written about this actually pretty extensively. Yeah. So in 1975, after the end of the U.S. war in Vietnam, the U.S. sends Vietnamese to bases first in Guam, and then to Camp Pendleton near L.A. or in San Diego, sort of southern Los Angeles, Southern California, to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, to Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, and to Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And that's in 1975. It's for about 6 months. I think this might, again, dovetail with our conversation later about the Venezuelans in Martha's Vineyard and why they were sent to a military base on Cape Cod. But the U.S. uses these 4 military bases in 1975. Vietnamese are held there for about 6 months. So, not a short amount of time, but not a long period of time. They are then resettled throughout the United States. The U.S. at that point had a policy of individual resettlement. The U.S. was concerned about another Miami. They did not want a concentration of Vietnamese in a specific city. But of course, people didn't want to be the only Vietnamese family in a small town in upstate New York. So people then traveled to Southern California, the D.C. area, Houston, the places where today we have larger Vietnamese American communities. Then in 1980, after the Mariel boat lift, the U.S. used those very same military bases again as refugee camps. The only difference is they opened up one in Wisconsin at Fort McCoy, and they didn't use California.
I think you can see a precedent in several ways. One is how we interned the Japanese Americans during World War II, we send them in remote areas of the country, right? Like these military bases. But secondly, sending these refugee and asylum seekers to all of these military bases in some ways was a precedent for Guantanamo Bay,
yes.
right? So this is not the first time we've sent people we don't otherwise want.
Right. Yeah, and the other thing that I will add to that, I agree, is that actually it is political. There's a direct political through line. So in 1980, when you have those Cubans sent to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas, which is sort of near the headquarters of Walmart, okay? So it's near Bentonville, Arkansas. It's sort of an interesting history in itself. Who is governor of Arkansas?
Clinton.
Bill Clinton. Yes. And Bill Clinton gets a lot of political pressure because people in Northwest Arkansas do not want Cubans, and there actually is there's both white nationalist protests against the Cubans, and there are Cubans who actually don't want to be detained on the base, and they march off, and there's a violent protest. So there is a lot of protest of both white nationalists and Cubans protesting the situation. This then creates a political problem for Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton loses the only election he ever loses in 1982. He's running for re-election as governor of Arkansas, and his opponent has a slogan like Cubans and car tags. There was like some sort of motor registration vehicle thing. But the point was that like it was about the anger about the Cubans. And so Bill Clinton, political lesson, refugees are a problem, Cubans are a problem. So when he is president in 1994, 1995, and you have the Cuban balseros, he then does send them to the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. I've not done research in the Clinton archive. I've not tried to actually see, does he talk about it like in his papers or documents? But I'm pretty strong ground saying that there's a clear through line from the political lessons from the 80s to the political lessons of the 90s. In addition, and this I think is a really good project, our undergraduates I think have mostly left, but good ideas for theses and master's theses, the key Reagan era official in Florida in charge of the Haitian program, which was about interdicting, sending Haitians back to Haiti, as well as detention of Haitians, was Rudy Giuliani. He was in the Attorney General's office in Miami in 1981. And I think that there is an argument to be made about Rudy Giuliani's investment in that detention of Haitians program in the early 80s, and then his militarized policing policies in New York City in the 1990s, in particular thinking about Abner Louima and the detention of Black people in New York City in the 1990s. And so to really think about where Haitian refugees and these two political figures in the early 80s having their political education form their sensibilities and their decisions in the 90s. Sure.
Just wanted to add one thing to what you were saying, Evelyn, about like the JA incarceration being a precedent. The other precedent we really have to think about is the reservations.
Yeah.
Right. So to put a connection with settler colonialism, like that's where the U.S. created enemies, right? And they are refugees, and they put them away into places like that. And we always have to keep that in mind as well too, because they're connected, right? These types of empire.
Yeah.
So we have a long history.
Yeah. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I really appreciate what you were saying about Giuliani.
Yeah.
And then, I appreciate your point about Giuliani and the mass criminalization through broken windows policing in New York, and then linking that to his prior history as AG and the mass criminalization of Haitians as de facto criminals. Yeah. Right? And I think that's a really important connection to think about criminalization as one of the logics through which all of this runs. But I have a different question. So, to me, I wanted to know what you thought about how your first book about the third country national workers, how that sets a precedent for the Iraq War being a contractors' war. Yeah. And then also thinking about how third country nationals are now kind of like the de facto base workers, not just as violence workers, but mainly in logistics and like cooking, cleaning.
Food services.
Yeah. Dock loading, dock workers, things like this. And really, they now outnumber U.S. service people. And so I wanted to think, I wanted you to help us think through how Guantánamo serves as kind of like a laboratory, also in terms of labor regimes in the U.S. military. And so like everyone's talking about Qatar right now because of the World Cup and like how thousands of people have died building those stadiums. But the U.S. actually uses the exact same human trafficking networks to supply its military bases all over the world from these exact same places, Nepal, Bangladesh, and then many other places. So I'm wondering if you could help us think through how Guantánamo serves as like kind of a experimental site or something.
Yeah, no, again, and I will... Yeah, sure.
I want to just add to my questions on this because it's not that dissimilar.
Yeah.
I just was wondering if you know of any kind of proto-migrant labor organizing in Guantánamo, because I've tried to look at this a little bit, and there are lots of like really happy stories of Jamaicans working on Guantánamo, saving up to go back to Guantánamo, to Jamaica. Right. Oh, yeah, sorry. I also have read that there's, that there's absolutely no minimum wage on Guantánamo, so the wages are abysmal. And I just wondered if you knew anything about that, so it seems like it's maybe close to this question.
So I'll do my best, and I have. So the answer is yes, and I guess I'll share one story from the archives, and then maybe riff a little on that. So. And I'm so glad, actually, this is a Latin Americanist crowd in some ways, because it allows me to sort of think through the Caribbean, and sponsored by your Latin American Studies program. But so when I was doing my research, I actually think it was a sort of a laboratory. I don't think that and I do think the U.S. military does think in systems and big, but I don't think that's initially why they hire Jamaican workers. They hire Jamaican workers because they fire the Cubans. So they fire the Cuban workers after the revolution. They say these workers cannot be trusted. They are suspect. They're creating problems. We're going to fire the Cuban workers. And so then they hire Jamaican workers. And this is in 1964. And Jamaica's only been independent for 2 years. So Jamaica independence is in 1962. And so it's an early guest worker program for Jamaica, because it's a guest worker program between the new Jamaican government and the United States to bring these workers to Gitmo. And I found a story, and this was one of my very first research projects, of Jamaicans working at Gitmo. It's the only protest I've ever seen. And they're angry about something. I don't know if it was about wages or about how they were mistreated. There could be all sorts of reasons why they were unhappy. And the U.S. government finds out that they had held a secret meeting. And there's I found U.S. government documents about a secret meeting of Jamaican workers in 1964. And the U.S. and so what I have is the U.S. government document. So I repeat what the U.S. government says about the meeting. I don't actually know what happened at the meeting. But the U.S. person who was informing on them or watching them said they met, and that one of the workers took a knife and pounded it into the table and said he was going to march to Havana and talk to Castro about his worker conditions. And he was fired. And the U.S. then deports all these people and sends them back to Jamaica. And the Jamaican government basically insists that, no, we will not send you any more people who create any problems. Like, this is not going to be a problem again. And that story always, again, stayed with me, because it was about both the Jamaicans going to work there knew about the Cuban Revolution, right? They understood that there was this radical possibility on the other side of the fence. And that I think that and there were racial politics about it as well. I think, I forget exactly the quote, but the person who uses the knife basically is saying, like, I'm not going to take this from white people any longer. And so there's a sort of a clear sort of racial politics, a clear radical politics, and they want to march to Havana. And they are fired. And after that, I found no more evidence of any type of worker activism. And I've seen no evidence. Now, I've not done a large look, and I said this is where not being at the base is a limitation, right? I tried to do some research, and actually the Jamaican government, because all of these third country governments profit from these relationships, right? I tried to talk to someone who helped negotiate the contract between the U.S. government and the Jamaican government. They wouldn't talk to me. I didn't try that hard either, I should add. I think if you want to do that research, you'd have to go to Jamaica and talk to the former or current workers, not on the base, where I think they would be, again, David Vine, when he went to the base, he told me he had to sign something that he wouldn't talk to the workers, that was actually like a group he was not allowed to speak to. So if you wanted to talk to them, I think you'd have to go to Jamaica. okay, and do that research there. And I imagine that any type of protest would be moderate and some very basic things about either wages or maybe time off, but nothing has shown up in the records that I've ever seen after 1964. And Naomi's point is correct, that this is how the U.S. Is able to have people work on its bases throughout the world. I do think that Gitmo, I don't know if it was the first one, I can't say that definitively, but it was clearly a very early case of that. And I think that the value to the U.S. military was really obvious pretty quickly. It was inexpensive, they aren't able to unionize, they don't have to protect their rights, and if there's a problem, they can be deported. And so that then multiplies, and today, one of the strangest documents I did find is in the Guantánamo Gazette, which is the U.S. military magazine on the base, and it was a group of Filipinos celebrating Philippine Independence Day on the U.S. naval base in Guantánamo Bay. And so to think about these layers of the War of 1898 and U.S. imperialism from the early 20th century, and to have Filipino Americans celebrating Philippine independence on the naval base, it kind of made my head spin. So the answer is yes. And there's a really good book called Empire's Army, and it's about Filipino workers on Iraq bases, and then Bosnian workers on those bases. It's a really good book. I can send you the title. I just read it. So, yeah.
Can I ask who the person was who negotiated?
The Jamaican?
And also, just thank you so much for locating
Yeah.
Cuba in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of the conversations like Cuba is somewhere else.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist in the Caribbean. So thanks for that.
No, you're welcome. So the short answer is I don't know. I spoke to an American-based lawyer who worked, and I'd have to actually, this was 15 years ago. I actually don't remember. But the Jamaican, I imagine it's the Jamaican Department of Labor. Jamaica has guest workers in the United States. Jamaica has guest workers in other countries. Right. And so I imagine that it's the same division in Jamaica negotiates for these base workers in the naval base in Guantánamo Bay. Occasionally, I think there's an article. I've seen ads. I remember when I was doing this. I did this research a long time ago, but I remember Googling and I would find a posting where the Jamaican government was looking for workers for these jobs. So, but it's. And there might be some newspaper articles in the Gleaner, but I haven't done that research in a long time. But I would imagine it to be the same part of the government that does the guest worker programs elsewhere.
But let's not forget that the U.S. brought a lot of Jamaican workers to Panama to build the Panama Canal.
Well, and those Jamaican workers are the ones who then moved to Guantánamo. Yes. Yeah. Right. So yeah. Yeah.
Not just Jamaican workers,
Yes.
but workers
Correct.
throughout the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's a better known
Yeah.
story, I think, than
Yeah.
the Guantanamo
Yeah.
Bay story.
But
Yeah.
they were there in large
Yeah.
numbers in Panama.
Yes. So it's 10:30. Oh, one last question. Great. Yes. One last question. Thank you so much.
Is it?
Hello. Yes. Okay. First of all, thank you so much. This has been very insightful, very, very interesting.
Thank you.
The class is amazing, but also getting to see the people that I've read for the class is interesting. So you and Naomi, I've read a lot of you. And then I had a question. So for our final paper, we have to explore something we're interested in about Guantánamo. And I was wondering if in all your research there was any specific intricacies or exploration of gender, because you brought up the question of race, and that is something that plays out very interestingly. But reading Guantánamo is always generalized about human rights, but there is very little exploring about the specific situation of maybe women. And I was wondering if there isn't much because there's not much differentiation in the refugee experience, or simply because it hasn't been as explored.
That's a fantastic question, and it's actually one I'm hoping to work on in a different sort of language or idiom in the future. But the short answer is I can't speak about the refugees at all. I've done no research on gender and the Cuban or Haitian refugees, obviously thinking about masculinity and the current detainees. But I'm going to answer that by talking about the Cuban women who are in my research and work, although probably not to the extent that they should be. So there are two places I talk about gender and sexuality in my work. One is that there was a lot of sex work in Guantánamo, and like in most military bases, there's a lot of sexual exploitation of Cuban women. There was also a lot of marketing from the Cuban point of view of Guantánamo women as nice women to go to dances with, particularly for upper-class Cuban women. So upper-class, they had a USO, which is like a sort of a dance hall for like it's sort of supposed to be clean fun for like the American military personnel, supposed to be in contrast to sex work. And so you had wealthier Cuban families sort of talk about the social exchanges with the sort of officers in the naval base. And so there's this sort of discussion about sort of women's sexuality as almost a currency, right, between the Cubans and the United States in a way of creating friendship, right? It was always about this sort of idea of friendship, which of course then ignored the violence and the sexual exploitation. And so when I would talk to people in Guantánamo, they would remember like, oh, right, like, you know, either things were not safe or sort of the fears of American sort of men's sexual aggression and sexual assault. That said, I found no evidence. And this does not mean, I imagine there were many sexual assaults, but there were no lawsuits or cases or major events about sexual assault in the naval base in Guantánamo Bay in Cuba. And so it was silenced, right? I mean, it's not in the Cuban newspapers. I looked at all the U.S. consular records. So either women did not feel as if they could go to the law, or this was something that was, you know, the government and the Cubans didn't want to talk about this either, right? I mean, it's like there was no cases of sexual assault in the written record that I found. So that's one not very satisfying answer. The second place I look at women and gender is I interviewed and analyzed women domestic workers. So we often talk about the Cuban base workers, and I also fall into this of thinking of them as male. They are disproportionately men, but there were also a significant number of Cuban women working on the base as domestic servants. These also were disproportionately Jamaican migrants to Guantánamo because they spoke English. And so again, this was a much better job for, a woman to be able to get a job as opposed to being in the sugar industry. And these women worked on the base. They were not unionized. You had a few women, I think, as clerical workers, but most were domestic servants. And so they had, of course, like most domestic servants, arbitrary employment, easily fired, easily exploited. But I would say that the two women who I interviewed, I think about 5 or 6 women. Two of them, I mean, they also remembered their jobs fondly. One woman I remember, she did remember this was a place where she first heard Elvis Presley. And she talked about her access to American culture and about sort of how exciting she found that. Another woman I interviewed, and this is a great story, she worked as a domestic servant on the base. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the U.S. evacuated all of the American women, so the white women, right, were all evacuated, and all their children were evacuated because there might have been a nuclear war. So they were all evacuated. But there still needed to be people to do work on the base. And some of those American wives had jobs, like at different stores or in different places on the base. So this woman was like super excited because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, she wasn't a domestic servant anymore. She got one of these good like office jobs during the Cuban Missile Crisis because there was all of a sudden these like spaces for her employment. And so that was another sort of unexpected place to think about gender. And I'll just add by quoting Cynthia Enlow, who is a brilliant scholar thinking about gender in the military, and she's really a formative scholar thinking about feminism and militarism. And she said when we study U.S. military bases, we always have to ask who's doing the laundry. And she said that at every single time I've ever heard her speak. She's like, who does the laundry? And that is where we have to sort of really think about who is doing the work on the base. So that is to answer your question about gender.
Thank you. And is there any place where I can find the interviews that you did with these women?
No, I actually, and I have not been able to archive them, but I could send you the chapter where I write about it.
Yes, okay. That would really be helpful. Thank you
That'd
very
be
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you.